So again, this is Michel Foucault, and we're looking at how power and knowledge are used to control people in society. Now, what he did specifically was Foucault looked at regulations in terms of power, how this control was used in society. In other words, how new structures of control are used. So if you think basic conflict theory, it says that economics is a structure of control because the upper ruling class controls society economically. And because of this, they also control society socially. Foucault took this a step further to look at how knowledge can control people. For example, it used to be that in order to control somebody in a prison, or maybe a high security psychiatric hospital, or even sometimes a school, that force would be used, force would be necessary. You know, it used to be common to give the strap at school or paddle a kid at school. But Foucault said that more and more modern social institutions, instead what he used, internalization of control mechanisms, and this will become a bit clearer in a second, using his example of shoplifting. If you think about it, imagine you're in a place, whatever store you like, and you know that the store has security cameras. And you're thinking of taking something without paying for it. And it just so happens as you're looking at something you really want, but you don't have the money for it, the sales clerk chooses that moment to go into the back to get something. And there's no other customers in the store, so you're there completely by yourself. And it crosses your mind. You think about taking whatever it is you want, but you don't. And why don't you? Because you know that there are security cameras in the store. Now, you don't know if these are security cameras that are actually being watched in some room somewhere, you know, by a guard with all these different cameras that they keep an eye on, like a live feed, or if it's just going to tape or what. But you know that the cameras are there. And just knowing that you might be being observed makes you act as if you are observed. Even the possibility of it controls you. And this is what he called an internalization of control mechanism. Even the possibility, this knowledge that you might be watched, controls you and keeps you from stealing. This is still control. It is social control, even though no force is necessary. Instead, there's been this internalization of the control mechanism, and Foucault said that more and more modern social institutions use this internalization of control mechanism. I think that's true. I'm going to give you another example because I referred to schools used to be able to strap their kids. My father, when he was working, who is deceased now, he was a principal here in North Bay at various elementary schools, and I'll have people tell me that my dad strapped them when they were a student. In the United States, currently, in some schools, particularly in the southern states, they have brought physical punishment for students back in. So it's not just that a teacher or a principal can do it whenever they want. Parents have to basically sign a permission form at the beginning of the year that certain procedures will be followed, and if it comes to that point, then their child will be paddled or spanked. So, and it's all very, very clearly laid out in the permission form. It's not just the first time. And even if it gets to that point when it's actually going to be done, the principal then phones the parent and says, this is what's going on. So they have full permission from the parents. But the reason I'm bringing this up is, in these schools, it is rarely used because just the threat of it seems to be enough. I read more than one article with teachers in these schools, and they say, you know, we'll have phones in our classrooms, like most classrooms do these days. And they say, you know, if it's behavior's really getting out of control, all I have to do is walk over to the phone and it stops because there's been that internalization of control. The students know the threat is there, and it's just knowing that knowledge helps to control their behavior. Now, Foucault also said that in every social interaction that you have, there's going to be kind of a struggle for power. And when he talks about this doesn't necessarily mean a great big all-out conflict. It doesn't mean a major struggle for power. I think maybe to say a struggle for dominance might be a bit more accurate. So he says that in every social interaction that occurs, you're going to be in a struggle for power. But within each of these interactions, there's also going to be resistance to that power by the subordinate in that interaction. So an employee and their boss, a teacher and a student, parent and child, even an intimate relationship, it's not uncommon for one person to have kind of the upper hand and have more control in the relationship. But because this exercise of power is never stable, because the person in a lower position of power is always going to be trying to gain more power and gain the upper hand, that's going to have an effect. They'll always have an opportunity to assert their own interests. So, Karl Marx said that there's always going to be class conflict because of competing economic interests. Foucault said there's always going to be conflict or a struggle over power. There's always going to be the need for dominant groups or a dominant person in society, like the upper ruling class, to renew their power, to maintain their power. But they're not always going to be successful. And this is when these dominant groups or dominant people, when they're not successful, when the upper ruling class is not successful, this is when lower status people or somebody who is a subordinate will have an opportunity to kind of change the relationship and gain more power. So Foucault is known as a post-structuralist, which can be a difficult term to grasp. So I want to explain it in as simple and straightforward a manner as possible. One of the important parts of post-structuralism is that everything you think you know about yourself and everything you think you know about your world is based on language. I quite like this concept, even apart from the post-structuralism part of it. Maybe because my mom was an English teacher, she taught English as a second language to adult immigrants and refugees. Maybe because my dad was a teacher. Maybe because, as a professor, I spent a lot of time focused on language. But I enjoy discussing the role that language plays. So one of the important parts of post-structuralism is that everything in your world is based on language. So how we all communicate, our values, each person's personal identity, even the kind of flowers you like or what you like to eat is based on language. So post-structuralism states that our reality is created by the language we use. Different languages emphasize different things. And because different languages emphasize different things, they indicate for the society in which the language is used that certain things are considered very important and relevant, or certain things are considered not as important, not as relevant. And what is something that is very relevant in Canadian and American culture, as indicated by the English language? Time. Think of all the different ways that the English language has to indicate or explain time. I am pretty sure I could come up with 100 more ways, 100 more words to indicate how important time is in our society. Now, in academic terms, this is called the hypothesis of linguistic relativity, how relative language is. The idea that the language you learn helps to determine your perception of reality. So in other words, people who live in different worlds because their language makes them aware of different aspects of their environment. We are hyper aware of time, and our English language demonstrates that. You don't need to memorize exactly what the hypothesis of linguistic relativity is, but I've brought it up here to demonstrate what Foucault is saying about the relationship between language and reality, and as an extension of that, the relationship between language and power. He takes this a step further, and I understand what he's saying. In our society, for example, in various ways, the word white indicates something positive, and the word black indicates something negative. A woman wears white when she gets married to signify purity, which is good. And traditionally, people wear black to funerals or when they're in mourning to signify something negative, mourning and loss. Typically, if something is light, it is considered good. If something is dark, it is considered bad, or at least not as good. So there is a relationship between language and power. But Foucault really points out that it shouldn't be so neatly categorized. Black and white are not total opposites. And he said that in our social world, our reality, that it's not exact. It doesn't always follow this absolutely perfectly straight line with one option on one end and the other option on the other end. So think of the words healthy and sick. You often say, oh, they're not very healthy or they're sick. What does that mean? There's an entire spectrum between those two words. Somebody could be sick, meaning they're in the last stages of cancer. Somebody could be sick because they have the flu or because they're simply not feeling well, their tummy is upset. Somebody could be healthy because they run marathons and do CrossFit, or somebody could be healthy because they're simply within the weight range that they should be for their height and their blood pressure isn't high. The textbook uses the example of the term opposite sex, even though males and females are in fact not opposites for the most part. The majority of the male and female body are exactly the same. They function the same way. The heart, the lungs, the kidneys, the stomach, the eyes, etc., etc. It's simply the sexual organs that are different, but otherwise we're pretty much similar. So according to post-structuralism then, our social world is not exact. Our reality is not exact. It's much more fluid. It's much more complex than that. It's not as strictly structured as previous theorists believe. This is why this perspective is called post-structuralism. I'm going to relate this to Marx and Weber. Marx said there's a lower class, tiny little bit of a middle class, and then the upper class, and that was it. Whereas Weber said, I don't disagree with you, you're not wrong, but there's much more to it than that. There's all these in-betweens. This is essentially what Foucault was saying in regards to our social reality. So that is Foucault in a nutshell. And I'm going to proceed to the third main sociological theory, which is symbolic interactionism. I really enjoy discussing this because it's focused 100% on socialization. Symbolic interactionism is a micro perspective. So it's not stepping back to look at the big picture. It's not just looking at individuals, but at the same time, it takes a smaller perspective on society. And I think part of the reason I enjoy discussing symbolic interactionism so much is because students can relate to it on so many levels because it's focused on socialization. I actually wish the textbook went into more detail regarding symbolic interactionism because it's such a relatable theory for students. And because of this, for me, it's a much more interesting and enjoyable one to discuss. So just like I told you to use the acronym SES for socioeconomic status if you're writing things down, just feel free to use SI for symbolic interactionism instead of writing it out. It looks at how people impart meaning to the things in their world. And as a result of this, how it affects their interaction. And I'm going to give you a lot of examples, but I don't think you'll have difficulty understanding this at all. Now, the first theorist I want to discuss regarding symbolic interactionism is George Herbert Mead. This is him here. And he looked at something that is a fairly simple question that has an extremely complex answer. I think you'll agree with this. Mead is regarded as one of the founders of symbolic interactionism. And what he focused on was, how do we all develop a sense of self by interacting with the people around us? How do you develop a self-concept? How do you develop feelings about how you see yourself or how you think about yourself? So, in doing this, I want to ask you a few questions. How do you think other people see you? This can be kind of an uncomfortable question, to be honest with you. I know it is for me. Do you think other people think of you as a fairly smart person? Do you think other people see you as a fairly attractive person? Do they think you're funny? Do they think you're shy and introverted, or do they think you have a really strong personality? Do you think that other people generally have a negative or a positive opinion of you? And I'll tell you, I think I've said, I'm headed towards 50. I still have these thoughts in my head all the time. Every fall, I have classes of at least 70 people, and I'll have a couple classes like that in the fall, in the big lecture theaters. And I have these thoughts run through my head all the time. I remember being younger and thinking that, when you're an adult, you always have yourself together, you know what you're doing and all that. Hate to tell you, but that's not true. Because as an adult, and it's not just me, I've talked to other people about this as well. How do I look? And maybe it's heightened because I'll have so many people just sitting there looking at me every fall in class. How do I look? What do they think about me? How am I coming across to them? This is what Mead looked at. And I'm going to give you an example that perhaps you have experienced yourself. So, in school, you have probably had opportunity to ask a question in class. I want you to imagine that at the exact moment you finish asking the question in class, other students around you begin to giggle. What you immediately think, whether you're completely conscious and aware of it or not, is, did they think it was a stupid question? Do they think I'm stupid for asking it? Did I just make a fool out of myself in front of the whole class? These might be thoughts going through your mind because you're trying to figure out the meaning of the giggling. You immediately take a look around the classroom to understand the social context of this. Do you have something on your face? Did your pen explode and there's ink on your arm? Do you look physically silly in some other way? You're trying to see yourself as the rest of the class sees you. At the same time, you're looking at the social context. So you're looking to see if there's something else going on that might have caused the giggling. Is there another student walking by the open door making a face at the class? Did the teacher do something and they're laughing at him or her? What Mead would say you're doing is you're trying to take the role of the other. You're trying to see yourself as others see you. You're trying to see the social context and the situation overall as others see it. And it's only when you're successful in taking on the role of the other that you'll be able to understand the giggling. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail about this here, but Mead talks about role taking and all this kind of stuff. I often tell students that instead of take the role of the other or role taking, in brackets beside that put viewpoint taking, because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to take the point of view of somebody else. So Mead felt that in fact all communication, all socialization is dependent on being able to do this, on being able to take on the role of other people, on being able to take on the perspective of other people. And he said we do this hundreds, if not thousands of times a day, often without even being completely aware of this. We do this over and over and over. We take on the perspective or the role of other people. And because we do this, we develop a sense of self. We develop a self-concept, a sense of who we are. And our sense of self develops, thus, through interaction with other people. It's not present at birth. So an infant is not born with a self-concept, with a sense of self. It develops through social interaction as they take on the point of view of other people throughout their life. So what this means then is, theoretically, in some kind of bizarro world, if a child was born and then 100% completely isolated, maybe they're raised in a lab somewhere with no physical or visual or verbal contact with another human being at all, that baby, as it grew into a child and then into an adult, would never develop a sense of self. Of course, even the idea of this is horrible, which is why this idea is sometimes referred to as the forbidden experiment, because it is an experiment that would be unethical and unmoral and unthinkable, in addition to being downright illegal. But there have actually been a few cases throughout history of children being isolated for a period of time that have been studied. These are cases that were not set up as an experiment per se, but were the result of neglect and abuse. For example, there was a little girl named Jeannie. This is a picture of her here after she was discovered. She was discovered by social services in 1970 in California, and she had been brought up for approximately the first 13 and a half years of her life, since she was about 20 months old, locked in a back bedroom and pretty much isolated. She had been born in 1957, and when she was born, her father was quite old to have a newborn. He was in his mid to late 60s, so he was quite old to be a father. He was fanatically religious. Not just conservative, but absolutely fanatically religious in a negative sense. And he was also pretty mentally unstable. And although it was never determined for absolutely sure, it's thought that when it became clear that Jeannie had some kind of minor hip defect at about 20 months of age, that he felt he was somehow protecting her from the outside world by keeping her in a back bedroom in their house 24 hours a day. Jeannie's mother, who was quite a bit younger than her husband, and who had quite severely limited vision. Technically, she was blind, although she could see a tiny little bit. And she was also thought to be mentally deficient. She was completely under the thumb of her older husband, and he was abusive towards her. So Jeannie was kept in this back room. She'd be kept in a crib with chicken wire over the top so she couldn't get out. Or she would actually be strapped into a potty chair. But, the window was covered, and they purposely had as little interaction with her as possible. Now, the only reason Jeannie was eventually discovered by authorities in 1970 was because for some reason, when her mother went to the local welfare office to inquire about a problem with their check, she took Jeannie with her. And to me, that kind of indicates just how mentally deficient her mother was. It didn't even occur to her to hide the child. And why would she suddenly take the child out of the room? And of course, when the workers there saw this little girl, they immediately called the police, which led to her immediately being removed from her parents' care and taken to the local children's hospital, where she lived for several months before she was placed into a foster care situation. During this time, again, it was determined that they had as little interaction with her as possible. So Jeannie provides a very sad, unfortunate example of what might happen to a person who does not have the benefit of social interaction to support their development. If you Google feral child or wild child, there are actually several cases of children being erased away from other humans, and sometimes living with various kinds of animals for various lengths of time. It's interesting if you want to take a look at this. But of course, again, to actually set up an experiment and test the effects of social isolation, the effects of a lack of interaction on the development of a sense of self is not possible. It would be completely unethical to do that to somebody, and I'll refer this again when we talk about research methods. So, symbolic interactionism. The third main sociological theory we're looking at, and it's based on some basic principles. So as I said, it's based on micro-level communication. It likes to focus on smaller scale social interaction. Functionalism and conflict theory take a much larger macro scale approach, but symbolic interactionism does the opposite. And from this smaller scale micro approach, it focuses on subjective meanings. All this means is it focuses on what every person's personal reality is and how it's constructed through meanings they themselves develop through their social interaction. As you are socialized, you kind of develop your own definition for things. And your definition is going to depend on how you have or have not been socialized. So I've got a bunch of words here. Aunt, on one hand, aunt, I mean, it's a very definite definition. An aunt is the sister of your mother or father. But at the same time, the social context of what an aunt is going to depend on the experiences you've had regarding your aunt or your uncle. Teacher is a good one because children, including myself, tend to have very different experiences with teachers. What a wife or a husband is. I mean, we have on one hand a definite definition of that, but at the same time, depending on what you have or have not seen growing up, what you have or have not experienced, will influence what your own subjective meaning is of a wife or a husband or family. It will influence what your own definition is of those things, and in turn, that will affect how you interact with other people. Love is a good one. People have various definitions of love, of marriage. And, I'm not saying this to be funny, but marriage, people tend to have different subjective meanings of what marriage is before they get married compared to when they are married. And then if they separate and have a divorce, that meaning will certainly change after they've been married. Monogamy or cheating or being faithful is another good example. Is somebody still being monogamous if they are exchanging intimate texts with somebody who is not their partner? Doesn't even have to be pictures. If they're exchanging, text messages, sexting with somebody else, would that be considered cheating on their partner? Some people say yes, some people say no. It depends on their subjective meaning. So symbolic interactionism focuses on what it refers to as symbols like language, gestures, written symbols. And it says that without these symbols, all of us would actually be no different than animals, because we wouldn't have any way to perceive each other. We wouldn't be able to coordinate our actions with each other. So your behavior towards things is based on the meaning that you personally attach to them. This could be objects, other people, ideas, even your own self. You act towards things based on the meaning you have for them, and these meanings are derived from social interaction. And this is continuously created. So, your meanings are always open to change, to evolution, maybe to de-evolution. As you move through life, no matter how old you are still going through the process of socialization. You're still interacting with other people and the world around you. You're always changing and developing. This doesn't necessarily mean in huge, massive, noticeable, significant ways, but just that you're always undergoing the process of socialization, no matter what your age is. And because our socialization never ends, the meanings we have for things are always open, at least to the possibility of change. So I want you to imagine you're a boy or a girl and you're in grade 7 who is just becoming interested in something more than friendship. Whether it's a male or female you're interested in, and maybe it's just me, but I have very clear memories of this in junior high school in the early 80s. I remember going on my first date with a boy, if you can call it that, since we met at the mall, went to see a movie together, and then we left separately. I even remember the movie. It was this cheesy vampire movie called Fright Night. At the time, I had a certain meaning in my grade 7 mind for what it meant to be interested in someone beyond friendship, for what a date was. I had a meaning in my mind for what a boyfriend or a girlfriend was, for what it meant to love somebody and have a relationship with them. Now, if you jump ahead to when you were in grade 12, and again, imagine yourself in that grade in the same situation, except grade 7 compared to grade 12, it's very likely, if not certain, that your personal definition for what it means to like somebody has changed, that your meaning for what a date is has changed, of what a boyfriend or a girlfriend is has changed, for what being in a relationship means has changed. Now imagine yourself as a fourth-year university student in the same situation. Or at age 30, having been married, what it means to be in a relationship has changed. So of course these definitions will continue to change as you get older. And that's why symbolic interactionism says these subjective meanings are dependent on the social context and social situation, and they're constructed through the process of social interaction and socialization. Now, something else that symbolic interactionism is based on, and I'm quite happy that this is included, is that we all have agency. And all the term agency means is you all have the ability to act with purpose. You're not just sitting there waiting for things to happen to you. You have the ability to behave intentionally. That's what having agency means. You can be proactive in life, not just reactive. And we all, as human beings, have this ability, this capacity. We're not just these empty vessels walking around waiting to react to things in society. Are human beings in many ways predictable? Do we like to stay in a rut and keep things the same? Absolutely. And the fact that we tend to be predictable and to react in similar ways lets us, as sociologists, then make predictions about human behavior. So getting back to the previous examples I used about the education system, and a lower status child and their likely educational experience compared to a higher status child and their likely educational experience. We can predict what the likely outcome will be of their educational experience, but we can't state with certainty what it will be. That's why I use the term likely. We can state what the probable experience and outcome will be, but we can't state with certainty. Because although social forces impact everybody, everybody has agency. Everybody has the ability to be proactive and make choices and act independently, not just be reactive. And finally, the last main principle of symbolic interactionism is that keeping in mind that every person does this, every person creates their own reality by attaching their own meaning to what is in their world. What symbolic interactionism then does is sometimes it ends up validating a point of view that's not very popular. That's why it says that it incorporates tolerance. You may not agree with the meaning somebody attaches to something. We might not like the meaning they attach to something. We may downright hate the meaning they attach to something. But symbolic interactionism can validate how they came to that meaning. So I want you to understand here that when I use the term validate, that doesn't mean their meaning is correct or right. Doesn't mean we agree with them. Doesn't mean that we endorse their meaning or their definition. It just means we agree with how the meaning occurred and evolved for them. So for example, somebody who is racist, and especially since Donald Trump became the President of the United States, there has been much more awareness of this in terms of what are known as white nationalist groups in the States. White nationalist groups have always been part of the United States. But until Trump acquired the presidency, they were much less vocal and less acknowledged by everybody else. Some of these white nationalist groups very vocally assert that as Caucasian people, they should be proud of their skin color and be allowed to be vocally proud of their skin color. That they should be allowed to celebrate being white without it being a problem. And they state that they're doing exactly what African Americans are doing, except just that their skin is a different color. However, these white nationalist groups are also associated with white supremacy groups who believe that in many ways, white people are superior to other races. So, would I agree with this assertion? 100% no, absolutely not. And if somebody did agree with it, they would be labeled racist. So, we would look at their beliefs and focus on how they came to that belief, how they were or were not socialized, the social interaction they did or did not participate in. And in doing so, symbolic interactionism would validate how they came to that belief, but not the belief itself. That's why it talks about having tolerance.